Kelsey Reinhardt, you have a ton of experience. You were the executive director of Media, EWTN, 6 different press offices around the world. What was that like for you?
It was a phenomenal experience. I every time I'm in Washington, D.C., I stop in and see my former novice mistress since I spent a number of years in religious life. And I asked her once, Sister Mary Angela, why do you think I've been given this window into the global church? And she said, well, I'm sure it's something to do with making the beauty of that global church known. And so it's definitely a context and a role that I take with me. It was an enormous job flying around the world, 6 different news agencies in 7 languages, but an incredible experience.
So I heard that you have a cool story about starting something in Iraq. What was that all about?
That's right. Probably one of the things that I'm most proud of in my career was traveling to Erbil, Iraq, a number of times in order to found a news agency, a Catholic news agency in Arabic for persecuted Christians in the Middle East. And the idea was to be able to broadcast to the global community if something happened, again, in a similar vein to what happened in 2014 with the ISIS invasion and the Iraqi genocide that resulted. And this was a really powerful experience visiting there. You know, you came face to face with the martyred church. And there was one evening at dinner, one of the times that I went to visit right before we launched the news agency, Iran had actually launched 12 ballistic missiles at the U.S. Embassy in Erbil. And the CEO of EWTN, Michael Warsaw, said, Kelsey, you don't have to go. And I said, Michael, every one of these journalists that we've hired has put their life on the line in order to tell the stories of Christ and the gospel and the Christian community in the Middle East. And I know that I don't have to go, but I want to go because I want to participate in the risk that they're also participating in. And I said, I don't think I could look myself in the face, in the mirror, having said, yes, it's worth risking your life and it's not worth risking mine to do this mission. And so I went and I got special permission from the Archbishop of Erbil, Archbishop Warda, to stay at a convent because when you check into hotels, you have to surrender your passport and there's a lot of publicity. It's a very public act. And so I stayed at this convent. And one evening over dinner, I was speaking with the sisters and I said, sisters, who are some of your favorite Iraqi saints? And the sister who spoke English the best reached her hand across the table and she grabbed mine and she just paused and she said, we don't have saints here. And I was taken aback and I was wondering where it was going to go. And then she said, we just have martyrs. And then the rest of the conversation, I get chills just reminding myself of this. The rest of the conversation was her explaining the martyrs that they knew and they loved. Some of the people that they had secretly baptized into the church for fear of honor killings. Some of the sisters who had been martyred in the ISIS genocide. Some of the experiences that they had going back to, and this is a living memory of a church, right? This church in Iraq was founded by the Apostle Mark. So the very first bishop, it was a church built upon martyrdom, and he was alive in their memory. And I was very haunted by the Chaldean liturgy. It almost had the air of a funeral sense about it, where that veil between life and death, and sadness and heaven is so thin that you can see through to the other side. I think that liturgy is born of those martyrdoms celebrated over centuries.
That's incredible. I just got chills hearing that. Now, why do you think it is that history is so unknown, untalked about in the West?
It's a great question. There is certainly a divide that you see between the societies. Just linguistically, it's very difficult to have that interface. It was a very closed society, recall too. When that sister was speaking, she talked about how Actually, ironically, in 2003, when the U.S. invaded, um, it was the first time that her community had heard the universal call to holiness. That sort of like internal proclamation, like, they'd always assumed that martyrdom was the universal call to holiness. And, the way that they lived that was very much a reflection of that. I've never seen a more penitential Lent than the way that these sisters, they wouldn't take a drop of water before noon, and there was no meat at any time during Lent. So it was a very austere time that I visited them. But they said, we first learned, about the universal call to holiness, that you could be a saint in these other, ways of just charity, that they felt like the United States opened that up. At the same time, they really understood that it was the initial 2003 invasion that unleashed upon the Christians in that country the tremendous suffering that would become the next 20 years. I mean, the sisters talked about bodies being thrown over their courtyard wall, into the cloistered part of the convent, because that was an easy place to dispose of them. I think there was also a form of intimidation happening. So, we don't talk nearly enough about what's happening to Christians in the Middle East, and it's a conversation that I think has to continue.
Well, it's silent to such an extent that I wonder if it's intentional, and even the subsequent persecution of Christians after the U.S. invasion. Like, was that not foreseen? You kind of wonder if to what extent these things were intentional.
Yeah, and there are heartbreaking stories coming out of it. I felt very privileged. I have this crazy father, Johann. Everyone calls him Crazy Papa Wicks. They don't even call him by his name. They just call him Crazy Papa Wicks. And in 2004, he actually heard about the Iraq war, and heard about a couple of things that were happening in Washington, D.C., bought a bike, affixed a cross on the back of it, and pedaled from Gillette, Wyoming, my hometown, to Washington, D.C. in protest. And he said that every pedal stroke was a prayer for the Iraqi people. And he stopped at every Catholic church along the way, prayed the rosary, had some miracles happen. It was a very unprepared for trip. He didn't plan it. He just woke up one night, felt like the Holy Spirit was calling him to do this, and then left the next day after learning how to change a bike tire from my 8th grade art teacher. So, when I was in Iraq, I felt like having been explained that connection between the 2003 invasion and the persecution of Christians, I felt like, wow, it is no accident that I am here. I felt like the pedal strokes of my father, all of those prayers for these people, were why I was entrusted with this mission to start this news agency and to try and reclaim in the public sphere this conversation about the persecution of Christians in the Middle East.
I hope that message goes out to a lot more people, including our leaders. Although,
Indeed.
I mean, if history is any gauge, then I'm not super optimistic about protection of Christians around the world.
Well, I do think, since we are in the midst of a conclave, and since my boss at CatholicVote has just been named the U.S. ambassador to the Holy See, I do feel like there are a few ears I might bend on this subject. And certainly there is a question, what's happening in Nigeria, what's happening in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. There are places around the world where what's happening in China. There are places around the world where significant enough that this needs to be raised to a higher level than it is right now within the church and also within the U.S. government.
Yeah, so you're at CatholicVote now. You're the head of Media and Evangelization. Your president just got a cool new gig. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, he has been nominated to be the U.S. ambassador to the Holy See. He's passed out of committee and is just awaiting his vote on the Senate floor for confirmation. And this is a really prestigious post. It's a really incredible honor for Brian to be nominated. And I'm excited to see the vitality and the thoughtfulness that I've seen with his long tenure at CatholicVote as a co-founder of CatholicVote. put to use in this context. So I definitely think that the persecuted Christians will be on his agenda in some form or fashion to assist.
So, with your direct experience with Brian Birch, what do you think are the pros and cons of him being in the position of the ambassador to the Holy See?
Well, I just see that he's going to be a great representative of the U.S. government to the church. He's a faithful son of the church. He has 9 children. So he's certainly going to bring a vitality to that ambassadorship that it's been a while since we've seen someone with that young come over to Rome. So he'll have 4 children who are still in his house with him. And I think that witness of having lived the church's teachings, having fought for the faith in the public square, which is what he did during his tenure at CatholicVote, I think that's going to bring enormous good to what happens over in Rome. I don't know what the agenda will be. I don't know if there's any cons right now in terms of the position. I think right now everyone's just looking forward to the hopefulness of what this appointment portends.
So, what was his take on the now deceased Holy Father, Pope Francis?
Well, Brian was certainly a faithful Catholic, and so he supported and loved the Holy Father. CatholicVote ran number of things. We run a very large newsletter in the United States, so he ran a number of articles promoting his perspective to the world. Obviously, there were elements of dialogue. I think Brian maybe was quoted in the New York Times as not having liked the Holy Father's comment about Catholics breeding like rabbits. But certainly he was a faithful son of the church and respected the office immensely.
Sure. Well, I would love to hear your speculation on the conclave.
Well, speculation in conclave never portends the way that you think that it will. But I certainly think that the conversations around what is most important for the church are extremely important. There is a financial crisis at the Vatican. I think more importantly, there is a crisis of ambiguity. People right now need clarity in order to live their lives. You've seen that in England, in LA, in France, record number of people were making baptisms and becoming Catholic. That's at the same time that we're losing, 8 out of every 10 Catholics, something like that. For every 10 Catholics that enter, 8 leave. So there certainly is a crisis in the United States of understanding what the church teaches and putting that into practice. The conversations that are happening right now in the general congregations as to what type of pope the cardinals would like to elect are extremely important. I would submit that one of the most important is actually how the church handles sexual abuse. So my experience covering Latin America and Africa is that there is a tremendous crisis happening in those areas. One that's maybe not as well recognized. It's much more in the shadows than the U.S. bishops' crisis in and around Boston in the early 2000s. So certainly the influence of religious orders and provincials seem to be where a lot of the same dynamics were happening. Priests were being transferred. People were not accountable for having abused persons. And so I definitely think that a zero tolerance pope and a pope that has no dalliance with this form of protection of evil is going to be essential to the future. We see that the church is growing in places like Africa, but Africa needs a sustained catechesis, and Africa and Latin America, I think we will see that they have struggled with abuse in ways that might shock us.
Can you just help clarify that? So, how would the zero tolerance policy look different from the current, or I guess former policy?
I mean that the Holy Father who's elected needs to have had zero tolerance, as in like no compromise with this form of evil in his management. Certainly, there are cardinals who have very significant questions around their past reporting of abuses and their past handling of abuse cases in their diocese. And, I would submit that that's an unwise person to elevate. I'm not a cardinal, and I won't be participating in the election, but certainly the aftershock of having elected a person who has, when there are many cardinals who do not have any stains on their record, the aftershock of having elected such a cardinal could be devastating.
Okay, so yeah, I'm just wondering if you could clarify that a little bit more. What exactly would a zero tolerance policy look like?
A zero tolerance policy would look like no tolerance for the abuse of children. So a priest would not be allowed to continue in their position having been found to have abused children. Priests would not be given a second chance. Priests would not be moved to another place in the diocese. Priests would not be, I think of the very famous case of Father Rupnik, who is accused of abusing over 20 consecrated nuns. He's still a priest. The entire female congregation that he abused for a number of years was disbanded, and the Mother Superior was sentenced to a life of penance. Father Rupnik remains a priest who celebrates Mass. So zero tolerance looks like zero tolerance. There is no party with evil. There is no compromise here in terms of who continues to operate as a priest once they have credibly been found to have abused minors, consecrated, violated, significantly the sixth commandment.
So you're saying remove their faculties. They can't perform the ministerial functions. Okay, gotcha. And then if a person in leadership, like you mentioned, a cardinal, has, I guess, like covered it up in some way, then they should also be, they should also be removed from their position.
Then they should be disqualified from their position. Certainly disqualified from leading the entire faithful worldwide.
I would hope so. Yeah.
I would hope so too.
It hasn't, let's just say historically, that hasn't been the first time that hasn't been the case. We've had some terrible Renaissance popes, which I guess perhaps like paradoxically actually gives me hope in the church that we're not in the worst times.
Certainly the church can survive that. But I do think, for instance, Father Rupnik could have been laicized during the tenure of Pope Francis. So we do see that even in the last pontificate, a policy of zero tolerance was preached, but not necessarily executed.
So who do you think are the front runners for Pope?
Well, the front runners right now, what I'm hearing are broad categories more than front runners. Obviously, there are some cardinals who've made a campaign at this beginning point, but from what I'm hearing, the cardinals really want someone who speaks Italian, who knows their way around the Curia. There are a lot of challenges that will be facing the Curia and its reform. This was true even upon the resignation of Benedict XVI. And they also want someone who has advanced studies, a sort of precision within the proclamation of the faith. They're hoping to have that. And then I've also heard that they're not looking for the quote unquote eternal pontificate. So Archbishop, Patriarch of Jerusalem, Pizzaballa, has been a fan favorite sort of on Twitter for a number of people. And he represents the East and is an Italian, but he's only 60 years old. And so I've read some media pieces on him, saying, well, I think that seems unlikely given where the cardinals are at because of how much they would like a pontificate that's shorter, since there isn't a great consensus yet about what sort of long-term needs the church has for a pontificate. But those are the categories, generally speaking, that I'm hearing the cardinals talk about. the clarity in proclamation, the need for Italian, and a suitable age.
Okay. Yeah. And what influence will, because there's a lot of, let's say, like cultural disagreement in the cardinals, political disagreement, perhaps, especially some of the ones that were appointed by Pope Francis, which is actually a lot of them. Um, so, what effect do you think the, I guess, polarization among the views of the cardinals will have?
Yeah. Well, it is interesting because 80% of the cardinals were elevated to the cardinalate by Pope Francis, but there is a certain way in which it goes beyond conservative and liberal in a number of places. So, what's interesting is that in the West, we have a crisis in a lot of different areas, including transgenderism, abortion, transhumanism. There are a lot of moral debates that carry a lot of weight in Western society right now, and people need clarity on those issues. When you travel to places like Africa or Malaysia or Myanmar, my African team at EWTN would laugh when I would explain, listen, we're having this problem in U.S. society. Men think that they're women and they want to compete in women's sports, and they laughed, so funny. I can't believe that anyone would ever think that. So,
That's so
even
refreshing.
it is refreshing. So a number of these cardinals who are appointed on the peripheries are very naturally conservative. They exist inside Muslim societies or alongside Muslim societies. They exist in societies that are untouched by some of the debates that are having in the West. So I do think that there is a doctrinal unity that's perhaps naturally conservative because the deposit of faith is naturally conservative, that these cardinals would represent, despite the fact that they're, quote unquote, the liberals elected by Pope Francis. So I do think it's a bit unhelpful to kind of brush too broadly with those terms. But I would say, though, that there is a real split, and we do see that in Germany. Germany has teetered here on the edge of schism with some of their stances. And the synodal way that was undertaken in Germany aims to overturn and really Protestantize the Catholic Church in Germany. And so there's going to be a significant need for discretion and prudence from the new Pope in how that situation gets handled. And then there's also the question of liturgical unity. I think that the question of liturgical unity will also remain an important one. There has been a worldwide growth in Lefebvrites. So as the traditional Latin Mass has been eliminated or reduced in different places, and a bit of an exodus has occurred, and we're seeing growth in areas that we shouldn't want to see if we want to preserve the unity of the Church. And I think that that will remain an important part for the conclave and the cardinals to decide. What is the role of the Latin Mass within the Catholic Church?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a non-schismatic version of Lefebvrites, which is called SSPX. I was actually in Rome for Holy Week. Went to this incredible Tenebrae service on Good Friday. I just could not. It was otherworldly. I can't describe it any other way. Turns out it was an SSPX service.
Well, the mystique and the transcendental nature of that liturgy, what's typically called the extraordinary form, is astounding. And you see this. I see the connection between the liturgies in the East, and that it's that veil between heaven and earth is so much thinner in those liturgies. The symbolism is so rich. We are catechized by symbols in the
Exactly.
Catholic Church. And so it's not surprising to me that this is a form of Catholicism that is growing in across the world.
Yeah. I think everyone should experience it. I mean, they can decide whether they want to that form of liturgy or not. But if you haven't experienced it, you're missing something. So, okay, Kelsey, you've been dancing around this a little bit. You said who is not a likely candidate. What are the general characteristics of a good candidate? So who are the actual likely candidates in your opinion for Pope?
Well, as I said, There are a number of likely candidates, and I don't know that it's worthwhile to get into the questions. Certainly, Cardinal Parolin has made an explosive burst onto the scene. Today, the Italian news reported that his signature was on the controversial document that allowed uh, um, the Vatican to lose over 100 million euros on a financial deal in London. So certainly every cardinal will have seen that walking into the conclave. I think that that's a potential transformative movement. So he certainly was afforded one of the front runner positions before the general congregations began. And I think that there are a number of others who've been campaigning or interested in this position, but I don't know that it's really worth it to discuss, who thinks that they will be pope and who these front runners are, because the old saying always holds true. You walk into the conclave as pope and you come out a cardinal. So I think
Oh.
I think that there are really interesting psychological dynamics that change once these cardinals are locked in a room. And Cardinal Sacco, who is himself Iraqi and patriarch of the Chaldean Church, actually said today, don't expect a short conclave. We need to get to know each other. We need to understand the positions. We need to be not surprised by the position that the Pope will hold. So I think we should expect that there will not be a 2-day conclave. And I think it is likely that it will be a surprising result.
What do you think about Cardinal Sarah?
I think that he has a tremendous deal to share with the West. I love his spiritual insights. I think he's an incredible man. I have also heard that it will be very unlikely for his pontificate to get off the ground. There have been rumors that French politicians are inserting themselves in trying to dissuade candidates from voting for him. Whether or not that those outside influences ever matters is always up for grabs. But there's no doubt that he's a wise man. His book on silence is phenomenal, and certainly he has a lot to say to the West about the spiritual crisis that it's in.
Wait, why would French politicians be campaigning against him?
Because I think he represents a view that is very controversial in their eyes. What he says is that the West has to recover its roots, and those roots are Christian. And if we look at his positions, they are in defiance of where mainstream French politicians find themselves.
Okay.
Mm.
Well, I can't say that it made my impression of French politicians any worse than it already was. Earlier, you alluded to the abdication, retirement, I don't know what you call it, of Pope Benedict XVI. Why do you think that he stepped down from office?
Mm. Well, I think certainly we can take him at his word that he didn't feel as though he could continue the office in the way that it needed to be shepherded and led. Um, it does require a tremendous amount of strength. If you've read his biography, you know that since one of his visits to Mexico, he was essentially cursed with insomnia. And the ability to perform day in and day out when you cannot sleep, the amount of stress and the weight. I mean, there is a reason that the Chapel of Tears is the first place that the cardinal who says Eccepto goes to is named that. I mean, it's a weighty office. It's something that requires tremendous strength, tremendous vitality, and a psychological resilience that becomes more and more difficult with age. So I think he saw that that reform was needed in the Curia. I think that he saw, that his own health was deteriorating significantly, and I think he thought that, according to his own representations, that someone else could do this with more strength and gusto than he.
Yeah, I had a similar impression. What kind of reform would be needed in the Curia?
Well, there's a lot of financial corruption. We've mentioned the financial crisis that's happened. The Vatican is, I think, um, a $90 million deficit in the last year or so, if I'm not mistaken. And, when papal apartments and other real estate have been seized from people who work in the Curia in order to farm those out in order to get rent and whatnot, people begin to look for other ways of funding their lifestyle. And I think that that's been a difficulty. I think that certainly, the oversight that's needed for that, Cardinal Pell attempted to ring warning bells around the financial situation of the Vatican.
And they took him out.
I don't think you can say that. The man died under a surgery, under the knife of a surgeon, not necessarily the knife.
Well, they put him in jail. I mean,
well, okay, all right, they did. That's true. The jailing there was highly significant to his health and a very unfortunate circumstance. So I think that the question also too of how long it takes to develop competencies in order to run these offices in a very professional way is important. If there does need to be a certain reignition of the zeal of the faith and charity and principles like that, the outward living of the faith of Curia members needs to be examined or looked at, then I think that takes a long time to find zeal, and it takes a long time to find competent people. So to create one or to find one is no small task.
Is there any cardinal who's emphasizing curial change and cleansing?
Yes, a number of them are. Not necessarily curial change, but this is the reason that most of the cardinals are saying he has to speak Italian. There's also a difficulty right now that's been left behind by the Francis pontificate in that the governance of the church has really suffered. Canon law is contradictory and confusing with some of the motu proprios of the Pope. And so there have been a number of acts that were just pen and paper by Pope Francis that contradicted governance styles. And so, part of the reform of the Curia is, okay, so what is the system that we will be using? What takes precedence here? Are lay people allowed to lead dicasteries? That's a question that's been raised in the general congregations. Is there a place reserved for holy orders? Some of the move towards synodality has left unemphasized collegiality. Synods traditionally were synods of bishops. And so, the move toward a synod that allowed voting lay members, it's created a lot of confusion. And a lot of these questions in governance ultimately have to be solved so that Curia members know how to act and how to respond in certain situations. Right now, this is kind of anyone's answer.
Well, I hope there is a cleansing. But if there isn't, the Holy Spirit will keep this ship going. So there's hope either way.
Johann, you're so funny. I hear so many people say, wow, just the Holy Spirit will take care of us. And yes, he will, but the Holy Spirit can knock and be rejected. Each of us has to listen. And, there have been situations that have called for true saints. The Holy Spirit took care of us during the Avignon papacy, but I'm pretty sure the Holy Spirit was not okay with the Avignon papacy. So I definitely think that we should have a very sober view of what potentially could be happening in Rome as needing real reform.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. That's why I phrased it as we'll keep the ship going. It's not necessarily that we're going to be going on smooth seas, but the ship will keep going.
Right.
So, yeah, and in terms of need for reform, I think that's been there pretty much since the earliest centuries. So, I don't see it change. I don't see it changing, frankly. As long as human nature is still afoot.
Yes, Yes. The old adage, the church is always in need of reform, ecclesia semper reformata, is
Yeah,
true. And that we are many instantiations of the church ourselves, right?
exactly.
Temple of the
Well
Holy
said.
Spirit. So also continuously in need of reform.
Yeah. Well said, Kelsey. Is there anything you'd like to share with us? You're so well informed yourself, so I appreciate it.
um, what would I like to share with you? Well, I do think certainly there's a lot to be hopeful in. I always love to end on the idea of hope because it's just so foundational to our faith. Hope isn't hope if it's seen, and certainly there's a lot of places where the church is active, the church is being martyred, the church is being faithful, and each and every day, no matter what happens in Rome, we can be participating in our sanctification through attendance in mass and confession, frequent confession. Um, and yeah, just renewing our vows, whatever those may be, as religious or priests or as married persons, striving to live, charity every day. So that would be my message.
Beautiful. Thank you for that. And I'll just throw out a comment too. I think it's important that people realize that it's a huge mistake to put your trust in human beings ultimately, and our hope is in the name of the Lord. So I think that's important when we talk about church scandals and so forth, which will always be there. So no matter who is the visible head of the church on earth, it's not going to be perfect, and that's not where our hope lies. So
There certainly is a beauty to this office. Strengthen your brethren, the call of the papacy, the call of unity within the papacy, and the respect due to the office is unparalleled in Catholic life. And yet, God has provided for the means of ordinary sanctification for every person. So I agree with you, we have to take advantage of those.
exactly. Well, I wish I could speak as refined as you do. So, well, thank you very much, Kelsey, and keep up the great work.
Thank you, Johann. Appreciate it.